This review of Destiny contains spoilers for the entire game. Destiny tells the story of the Guardians, warriors struggling to fight back a darkness that threatens all of humanity. After the Traveler was discovered and ushered in a golden age, the darkness that hunted it eventually plunged the world into chaos. This led to the collapse and the eventual abandonment of every city on Earth, save for one. Destiny starts you off in the ruins of Earth and takes you on a journey across the galaxy. Destiny's introductory cinematic is gorgeous. It effectively highlights the graphical capabilities of current generation consoles. More importantly, it crisply conveys the setting of the game using visual imagery of the desolation of Earth. I really love when games avoid using heavy-handed narratives to progress the story, opting instead to make the setting and gameplay mechanics self-explanatory. Not only is this more succinct, it also makes the game world feel more consistent. Before diving deeper into Destiny's story, it's worth highlighting that the game does not neatly fit into a single genre. Destiny is a three-way hybrid between an MMO, first-person shooter, and story-driven action-adventure. The three systems coexist at the same time. Players will find themselves participating in MMO-like events on their way to a story mission, or playing multiplayer to earn crucible ranks to get the latest and greatest gear. Unfortunately, this coexistence is very rough around the edges, and often leads to Destiny's game systems contradicting each other. The initial cutscene and tutorial do an excellent job setting the stage for Destiny's plot, but they lead the player into the tower, where he or she immediately encounters dozens of other players, shopping, turning in bounties, and invoking emotes. This is a jarring transition that quickly breaks the player's immersion. This continues more or less unabated through the first story mission. How critically important could this aircraft be if this other guy over here is spending his free time ramming his Sparrow into it? Destiny is not exclusively a narrative-driven single-player game, so I'm willing to forgive it for not being completely immersive. However, the only way to progress through the game and access all the environments is to proceed through the story, so its coherency will affect everyone who plays through the game, regardless of whether they're interested in it or not. On the plus side, most of Destiny's stories progress through cutscenes. These cutscenes universally had excellent visuals and sound design. When the stories progress through gameplay, in particular when new enemy types are introduced, Destiny delivers a fantastic cinematic experience. The introductions to the Hive, Vex, and Cabal enemy types are all memorable encounters. Unfortunately, the effectiveness of these cutscenes is dampened by their content. Destiny's plot is highly character-driven. The player proceeds from planet to planet, largely in response to what other people in the galaxy do, from the mysterious stranger to the Queen in the Reef. Character-driven plots are tricky because they take focus away from the player. This can be done successfully when games take the time to allow the player to build a working mental model of how they fit into the galaxy in relation to everyone else. This allows the focus to ultimately center back on the player and their relationships with other NPCs. The Mass Effect series in particular is good at doing this.
Let us tell them.
Destiny doesn't take the time to provide much context about the world, so players are left interacting with characters whom they don't care very much about. This causes most of the cutscene sequences to feel melodramatic and largely unnecessary. The Reef is the best example of this. Without any background on the Queen and her brother, it's hard to care very much about their personality quirks or internal political strife, and the characters end up feeling shallow instead of interesting. This lack of context also causes the game world to feel incoherent. One of the questions I asked myself as I played through the story was why I was doing any of this at all. It seems as though life was pretty good before the Golden Age, and got pretty bad after the collapse. Perhaps humanity would have been better off had it told the Traveler, all those years ago, to just leave it alone. I imagined I would run into some NPCs who had reached a similar conclusion. Yet there is no political strife in Destiny, and in fact, no real conflict at all. Sure, you fight lots of enemies, but in many cases you actually end up shooting first, as your so-called enemies peacefully pray to their gods. Not only does this lack of conflict make the plot overly simplistic, it makes the game world feel as though it shouldn't quite fit together. Here, again, Destiny's multiple game systems come into conflict with each other. When I had received the quest to find the Black Garden, I stopped off at the tower to collect some bounties. One of the available bounties was a strike on Mars, inside the Black Garden. It appears that if Ghost had instead chosen to link up with the bounty tracker guy, Earth would have been saved a lot faster. Ghost, unfortunately, is the most problematic NPC in the game. He serves as your AI companion, opening doors, finding the next place to go, and adding commentary to your journey. One of the best features of Bungie's Halo series was Cortana, Master Chief's AI companion. She greatly offset the otherwise oppressive nature of Halo's environments and storyline. I'd imagine most Halo players have fond memories of Cortana, and I was hoping that Ghost would live up to this pedigree. Unfortunately, he fails to do so. Before I dive into the problems with Ghost, I should explain what makes AI companions successful in games. The fundamental tenet of AI companions is that they must not get in the player's way. Doing something useful is actually secondary. Games put their focus on the player, and AI companions are intended to complement that focus. Getting in the player's way fails at this first fundamental mission. The second tenet of AI companions is that they have a purpose that they are uniquely positioned to provide. Whether enabling the player to strategically control the battlefield, provide contextual hints, or add to the game's narrative, AI companions should have a clear purpose. Remember, any AI companion in any game could be replaced by a magic box in the sky that does exactly what the companion would do at the press of a button. Game developers opt to use companions instead because they immerse the player in the game world and add to the gameplay or story. Cortana was an excellent companion because she did both. She assisted the player, immersed them in the world of Halo, and even built a relationship with the character that is explored in the Rampancy storyline, all without inconveniencing the player. Ghost, in contrast, fulfills neither of these key tenets. Ghost's primary purpose is in progressing missions by hacking into computer systems. Unfortunately, Ghost has no sense of proactivity. The player must always manually deploy him. This is often problematic, as the area where Ghost should be deployed is often unintuitive and hard to find. This is particularly problematic in patrol missions, where finding the exact right spot to stand can be tedious. I imagine this was done to enable the player to stage their own progress. Deploying Ghost typically means starting another fight, and Bungie probably wanted players to take their time and collect ammunition and loot prior to proceeding. However, this is easily solved by having Ghost auto-deploy, and patiently waiting for the player to hold down the X button from any location. Ghost's second purpose is navigating the player through the world, either to the next checkpoint in story missions or to the next patrol opportunity. Unfortunately, the navigation mode is jarring to get into and difficult to use. Upon starting a patrol or finishing a patrol mission, players often have to wait 10 to 15 seconds for a mission to pop up on their map. As soon as they begin running toward it, navigation mode fades away. Bringing it back causes the player to stop running. This is cumbersome and inconvenient. I imagine it was an optimization made for PvP, but it has no place in PvE. Continuous on-screen navigation modes are a convenience feature that have been included in games for years, and for good reason. Ghost's last purpose is to be the player's companion, provide narration on the story, and act as the player's foil during cutscenes. Ghost was, for some reason, unfortunately written to be cowardly, insecure, and fairly unintelligent, and I don't really fully understand why this is. He acts more like an idiot sidekick than a real companion. The background that he provides on the story is often wrong or unnecessarily hyperbolic. This is most noticeable when he talks about the indestructibility of the Vex, whom the player summarily massacres just minutes later. Where Destiny really shines are its core gameplay mechanics. Destiny's shooting and movement mechanics are tight and fluid. Critical hits are well balanced, providing a significant reward while being just difficult enough for players to still get a feeling of accomplishment. The weapons are responsive, and it feels impactful when the player shoots an enemy with them. The enemy AI can be hit or miss, but generally works pretty well. Different enemy types employ different tactics, from being slippery and evasive to aggressive but fairly dumb. Enemies respond to your movements and attempt to respond tactically, but this is rarely successful. The enemy AI is at its best when it's coming after you. When you're chasing after it, you've probably already won. Destiny also includes a number of subtle design optimizations that one would expect with Bungie's Halo background. For instance, straggling enemies often automatically disappear when a player is close to completing their objective, a subtle but very helpful inclusion. Destiny offers a number of difficulty modes on each mission. Story missions offer a normal and hard mode, balanced around level. I played through every story mission on the hard difficulty, and the balance consistently felt right. I rarely felt overwhelmed or outmatched, but I also rarely felt too easy. Strikes typically have a single level, but once you reach the maximum level, you can pick a difficulty that suits you best. Strike playlists offer a number of different difficulty modes with adjusted rewards. On a couple of occasions, I did attempt a difficult mode a couple levels higher than me, and they felt an order of magnitude more difficult. Destiny's instancing is seamless and practically unnoticeable. Destiny employs two types of instances: public instances, where you can interact with other players who happen to have been placed in the same public instance, and private instances, where you, and your fire team, if you've got one, get a private dungeon to battle against enemies. I played through every story mission in single player, and on a couple of instances was so surprised by the transition from public to private instance that I wondered where everyone had went. This helps hide a common flaw in MMOs, wherein players are given a quest to collect a so-called unique item that other players are literally in the midst of collecting at the same time. It's hard to understate how well this works. Even in today's popular MMORPGs, loading screens are the norm. Unfortunately, Destiny is not immune from loading screens, and there are two areas where this becomes a problem. The first is any transition from a planet to orbit, or from an orbit to a new location. Each transition often takes over 30 seconds. The second is in the Crucible. The time between the end of a match and the beginning of the next one is typically around 3 minutes. With matches lasting between 10 and 12 minutes, this means you spend about a quarter of your time just waiting for the game to load. Destiny's tight gameplay mechanics, unfortunately, don't really carry over into its MMO aspects. New players move up in level and unlock skills at roughly the same pace, creating an illusion that these systems are tied together. They are actually largely independent. If players choose to switch their subclass at level 15, they will discover that they can no longer throw grenades or lift off of the ground. This breaks a fundamental tenet in MMO-like games. Never make the player feel like they're actually regressing and getting weaker. After opting to level up my defender skill set, I was shocked to enter the Crucible and have no grenades and no lift. Allowing players to select one of two subclasses on its face may seem like it has some advantages. A common theme of MMOs is players having to level up alts to do things their main character can't. Unfortunately, Destiny's implementation makes it feel like you're nerfing your main character by selecting a different class, and the only way to get out is by grinding. This oversight could have been easily solved. A number of basic skills, such as grenades, lifts, and the initial codex, could have been determined by the player's level rather than their class. Players would still feel a nerf switching from a fully skilled subclass to an unskilled subclass, but the basic game mechanics would still be in place. Destiny also avoids segmenting players as much as possible, a decision that works out mostly badly. Before I explain why, I should explain what I mean by segmentation. Most MMOs have players progress through zones demarcated for their expected level and equipment. As players level up and get better gear, they move on to the next zone. This offers two important advantages. One, players get a consistent sense of progress as they move from one area to the next. Two, it prevents players from feeling underpowered or behind, regardless of where they stand relative to the server average. Destiny replaces this model with a gated approach. Players access new environments as they level up and complete storylines, but the game gives them plenty of reasons to go back to the zones they started in, such as strikes, equipment grinding, and bounties. This results in low-level players continuously encountering high-level players in the same zone. This breaks the sense of progression. An MMO should never push you to reach the maximum level. It should push you to reach the next level. This enables a smooth sense of progression that feels tailored to each individual player. Destiny, in contrast, tries to get as much mileage as it can out of the environments that it's built by encouraging everybody to go everywhere, ultimately weakening the sense of progression and accomplishment that new players get.
See what they're after.
This is design philosophy at its worst in the Crucible, where there is no separation between high-level and low-level players. Players who have obtained more skills have an inherent disadvantage, which at best feels confusing, and at worst unfair. This is compounded by the game incentivizing you to participate in the Crucible through bounties and other rewards early in the game. Players who max out their 100 Vanguard marks for the week will likely spend their time getting Crucible marks in multiplayer. This is a known problem in MMOs that is solved by segmented zones. Aside from the occasional high-level character who trolls new players, players in all zones are able to fight with and against at around the same level of progression as them. Players rarely feel as though they have a significant advantage or disadvantage, so every new level or piece of equipment feels like a huge win. You've gotten an edge over your compatriots. In contrast, fighting against high-level players in Destiny feels like a constant uphill battle. Here, Destiny is again subtly pushing you to reach the maximum level, rather than enjoying the journey there. It's true that the Crucible is not quite like the PvP that you see in MMOs, and it might be more reasonable to compare Destiny with a game like Battlefield. In Battlefield, players unlock skills and equipment as they progress, but can play with or against anyone as soon as they begin. This comparison, though, does a massive disservice to games like Battlefield in two very critical ways. First, in both Battlefield 3 and 4, there was a painstaking effort on the part of the development team to ensure the starting guns and equipment were reasonably good. In fact, in my opinion, one of the medic classes starting assault rifles in Battlefield 3 is one of the best guns in the game, and the same is true for one of the starting sniper rifles. Destiny, in contrast, allows the player to enter the Crucible without a heavy weapon, or the lift skill. Second, games like Battlefield enable players to contribute to their team's success in many ways, and makes it hard for them to hold their team back. Individual kill-death ratios are rarely very important. Destiny's score-based system, even in the Control multiplayer mode, is heavily tilted both toward getting more kills and not getting killed yourself. New players can always choose to avoid the Crucible until they level up, but many don't because, as mentioned before, Destiny incentivizes them to participate. Destiny improves on the leveling mechanics of similar games in its endgame. The soft level cap based on experience is level 20. Beyond that point, players level up by acquiring equipment with more light attached to it. This is a great formalization of an informal mechanic that has existed in most other MMOs. The endgame of MMOs is typically focused on acquiring better equipment. It makes sense to tie a player's level to that, too. Experience is used after level 20 to upgrade armor and weaponry, ensuring that players still receive benefits from getting it, even if they don't get great loot drops. As players move through the world of Destiny, they will encounter 4 enemy types: the Fallen, the Hive, the Vex, and the Cabal. Each enemy type contains subgroups of enemies that work together, such as sniper-style enemies that take potshots, as aggressive, short-range enemies distract the player. Overall, the enemy variety in Destiny is low when compared with the large scope of the game. Many enemies have similar designs and AI behavior. The Fallen and Hive were reminiscent of the Covenant, so they honestly didn't feel fresh. I was really only impressed with the Cabal, whose jetpack legionnaires, phalanxes, and psionic enemies felt interesting and fun to fight against. I would have liked to see Bungie take more risks in this area. On top of the standard enemies, story missions often feature a single mini-boss, whereas strike missions typically feature 1 to 2 mini-bosses and 1 end-boss. The story missions bosses were visually interesting and fun to fight against. The combination of unique boss stages, visuals, and movesets kept the fights fresh, and the boss's HP and attack was well balanced and never felt unfair. With the exception of the last story mission, there was very little boss recycling. In contrast, the strike missions are an unbalanced disaster. The mini-boss and end-boss segments of strikes were unabating bullet sponge enemies. On strikes set to or below my level, these enemies often took upwards of 10 to 15 minutes to kill. I have no idea who at Bungie thought this was fun, but it's not. Low-level strikes completed at a high level do get faster, but not enough to make them compelling or interesting. I'm willing to give Bungie some leniency here. This is their first MMO-like game, and they're still learning how to balance it. I trust that these missions will get corrected in a future patch. There's already a gameplay system in place to prevent players from grinding strikes too quickly, which is the cap on Vanguard marks. Teaming up with strangers on strikes is typically a frustrating experience. Players often leave in the middle, don't follow along, or don't contribute very much to the fight. Bungie takes some of the blame for this by partially instancing strikes. Strikes often begin in a public instance and transition into a private instance, giving players plenty of opportunity to get lost rather than follow the group. Fortunately, if players leave a strike, other players can join in the middle, but this is at best a mitigation, not a solution. I'd really like to see some sort of penalties imposed for leaving strikes too often. A reputation system might go a long way in encouraging good behavior. Aside from strikes and story missions, players can spend their time on patrols. These are effectively open-world exploration of the different planets in Destiny, where players can complete missions, grind enemies, and participate in random events. Missions are often hit or miss because Destiny does not enable players to accept multiple missions at once. More than once, a mission prompted me to go deep into a dungeon, complete it, come all the way out, then gave me a mission to go all the way back in again. The different types of missions, such as fetch, scan, and kill, are marked by separate icons, but this isn't explained to the player and is easy to miss. The environmental design of the patrol areas is largely disappointing. Rather than being truly open, areas are segmented by long paths filled with lots of enemies. I can't tell whether this is a developer trick to hide the loading of the next area or intentional level design, but in either case, it's tiresome and makes the world feel much less cohesive. On the plus side, players can navigate most of the patrol areas using the Sparrow. The Sparrow is fantastically implemented. It's intuitive to control and fun to ride around on. Navigating tight spaces is relatively easy. The vehicle is a pleasure to drive, and if it weren't so inconvenient to summon, I would do it a lot more often. While navigation mode is a very disappointing UI, I want to highlight that I really liked most of the UI that Destiny has to offer. Destiny uses a point-and-click interface that is unintuitive at first, but easy and convenient to use once you get used to it. The speed of the cursor and the friction on different equipment types feels finely tuned. It really shines during character creation, where it took me just a few minutes to adjust about a dozen options and quickly get the character that I wanted. I have never understood why so many console games, particularly RPGs, use a wheel navigated by the control sticks to access your inventory. In theory it sounds intuitive, but it never works out in practice and always feels cumbersome. I can't tell you how many times I've selected the wrong item when using the wheel-style interface due to its inexactness, to the point where I stopped playing the Witcher series due to how much I disliked it. I'm really glad Destiny broke the mold here, and I'd like to see more game developers follow their lead. Buying items is simple and intuitive. Destiny's Tower City has more than a dozen NPCs selling a plethora of items. Many NPCs serve only a minor purpose. It seems like these NPCs were added to justify the tower's large size, and I'd prefer that some of them be unified and trimmed down. The tower largely acts as a holding ground for shopkeepers, which feels like a missed opportunity. Even something as simple as joining the Crucible or a Strike playlist directly from the tower would have saved a ton of loading screens. The character screen is also well designed, surfacing all the important information at a glance. Dismantling equipment is easy and switching guns is quick, often fast enough to do in the middle of a fight. The text is clean and easy to read. Subtle visual indicators, such as the increased font size of armor's defense and light rating relative to its description, makes navigating the interface convenient. This attention to detail is a running theme in Destiny, and makes the game far more pleasant to play. The UI does have some quirks, such as the inability to press back once you've selected a mission, instead of having to go back to select a destination. Most of the NPCs in the tower haven't been clipped properly, making the game feel unfinished. The light progress bar is hit or miss in its accuracy. Another quirk of Destiny is its succinct, often sparse, explanations of game mechanics. Destiny avoids forcing you to read lengthy explanations of how the game works. I really like this soft-touch approach. Games are often too heavy-handed about explaining game mechanics, not trusting players to just figure it out. I encountered a number of technical issues playing Destiny. I never expect a game I buy close to the release date to be perfect, so many of the issues are forgivable. For instance, to this day, I am unable to boot up Destiny with sound. I have to go back to the home screen and relaunch the game. This is a classic post-release bug that will certainly be ironed out. More problematic are connection drops that kick you out of the game. On one occasion I couldn't start the game for about 30 minutes despite having clear connectivity to Xbox Live. On others, I was directly kicked out of the game. This is most frustrating when it occurs during single-player missions, where there is really no need for me to be connected. I have no philosophical opposition to always online games. It's a restriction that developers can reasonably add if there's a reasonable value add. I don't see that in Destiny. Loading screens are among the worst of any game I've played, and neither the graphics nor the enemy AI are so good that they appear to be cloud-driven. Kicking players out of single-player missions feels very customer-unfriendly. I have a reliable internet that has never dropped after months of playing Battlefield, yet I have experienced multiple connection drops in Destiny. Destiny's multiplayer is reminiscent of the Halo titles and includes a variety of different modes, including deathmatch and holding and controlling zones. There was also a mode for salvaging relics, but for whatever reason that is no longer available to play at the time of this video. The maps are varied and it never feels like you can play any one map the exact same as you do the others. Some even have vehicles thrown in for good measure. The balance of Destiny's multiplayer is hit or miss. On average it's usually pretty good, resulting in evenly balanced teams and a relatively close end score. However, too many games still turn into blowouts, often because players leave. Players can join matches in the middle, but it's rarely enough to change the result. This is a problem in all multiplayer games to a certain extent, but Destiny's small teams and short matches exacerbate it. Similar to Strikes, I'd really like to see Destiny punish players who leave games too often. The multiplayer seats that leveling is not a factor, and this is grossly misleading. While your level doesn't matter, your skills do, from grenade types to special attacks to your strength of your lift. I remember at early levels, I wasn't quite sure what to do with heavy weapons ammo. That was because, in my single-player progression, I hadn't yet found a heavy weapon. The most perplexing aspect of Destiny's multiplayer balance are special skills. Special skills often enable players to one-shot each other. This is fun at first, but ends up feeling cheap and unbalanced as you go along. Overall, Destiny lacks the fine-tuned balance of the Halo series and the guild and zoning mechanics of other popular MMOs, leaving its multiplayer balance in a schizophrenic limbo. The sound design of Destiny is mostly good. Action sequences have dramatic upswings in tempo with a sudden downswing when the action ends. The initial introduction to the Hive had excellent music that set the tone very well. On the downside, the wondrous, inspiring music in the tower conflicts fairly badly with the otherwise oppressive storyline, which is jarring the first time you hear it. Most players will quickly realize that Destiny's storyline is not worth paying attention to, and the music is their first clue. Overall, Destiny contains a number of design quirks, imbalances, and misses that ultimately cause it to fall short of being a great game. The narrative is irrelevant and schizophrenic, the MMO features aren't well balanced, and Ghost is a tiresome companion. However, its tight gameplay mechanics and subtle design optimizations means that players who enjoyed the Halo series will get some decent mileage out of this title as well. It gives me hope that the next iteration of the series will be a significant improvement.